Okay, so this is my slideshow about my paper. I chose to research women in Greco Roman history with an early Christian context. There was a lot of things that were pretty interesting about women at this time. Some of them were things that I would have expected, like their work in the household as wives or mothers. But some of it was a little different. They had a lot more independence in certain contexts than I would have imagined, so that was really interesting. So Greek women were probably Greece was probably the most patriarchal of all the societies that I researched. So they probably spent the most time at home, taking care of the house, taking care of their kids, except Spartan women. Spartan women did do those things, but they had more independence than like the rest of Greek women, like Athenian women. Roman women also spent a lot of time in the home, but they had some unique liberties, kind of like they could own property. And I even read that in some cases, so it was rare, they could actually work outside of the house, like own a business or be a doctor or something. And then Christian women, my favorite to research, honestly. They also worked in the home, but it was not uncommon for women to work as missionaries or deacons in the church, which I think is so cool. Okay, so here's my introduction. Women of this era were totally amazing. They lived through fairly patriarchal times, and they still managed to find ways to be independent and leave their mark on history. So, I'm going to go into a little more detail about Greek women. So, Greece was more patriarchal than Rome or the early church, as I mentioned, but they still had important roles. So, women in Greece. Their primary role was as wives and mothers, working in the household to take care of their children and to do house chores like cooking, cleaning, and sewing. Spartan women were a little different. Yes, they had a lot of work in the household, but they also had more independence. Spartan men were often gone fighting in wars, so that left women without having someone to tell them what to do all the time. Spartan women actually got to go to school and have an education, and on top of that, they got to own property. There were actually more Spartan women than Spartan men that owned property in ancient Greece, which I find very fascinating. So now I'm going to move on to Roman women. So in Rome, it was pretty similar to how it was for women in Greece, but they generally had more independence than, say, Athenian women did. So Roman women, very similar to Greek women in the household. The whole point of being married was to have children, so they would stay at home, take care of their kids, cook, clean, things like that. So that was the most prominent role of a woman in Rome, just like in Greece. But Roman women, it was easier for them to have independence, like, say, owning property. Here I have a quote from Beard. It says, "Therefore, a Roman woman could own property, inherit money, or even determine the rights of slaves." This was something that British women didn't have access to until the 1870s, which is a really cool thing that she brings up. To think that women almost 1,000 years ago in ancient Rome had the freedom to make financial decisions or own property, or, according to an interesting PBS article, sometimes work outside the home as a doctor or a hairdresser or running their own business, while women in Britain or, the United States in the 17 or 1800s couldn't do that. It's really interesting. So lastly, there are early Christian women. Christian women, also obviously wives and mothers like Roman and Greek women, but it was more common for them than Greek or Roman women to work outside of the home. So Christian marriages, they were also an important thing, but the whole point of a Christian marriage was not just to have children. Christian marriages were actually more focused on mutual love, and actually, according to Paul, he thought it was best if maybe you didn't get married, and instead you could just stay single and focus on God. But a marriage was actually, in his opinion, a way to prevent you from being tempted to commit some kind of sexual immorality. So that's very different than Greeks or Romans. It was all about having children for them. Christians had other ideas in their mind for marriage. But it was still important for the woman to have a family and to take care of her children and her husband if she was going to be married. But outside of the household, women can have really cool roles like deacons, missionaries, worship leaders. I researched a really interesting book by Christoph Stenschak. It's an article actually called Married Women and the Spread of Early Christianity. He mentions a woman named Junia who was a leading member of the church in Jerusalem and also traveled as a Christian missionary in the diaspora. That's really, really cool to me. Because if we remember, I feel like even in the 1950s and 60s, women in America and in the modern Western world were not allowed to lead. And often they felt that that was scriptural. But if we look back in history, Christian women were leading all the time. So that's actually false. Another interesting PBS article discussed several early Christian women that had really cool leadership roles. Phoebe is a deacon that Paul greets in the Bible. She's leading in the church. Some other women are Priscilla, the wife of Aquila. She was a church leader. Mary Magdalene. She was a leader. There's a very long list I have here in my paper. But it's really, really fascinating. So God could use women just as much as he could use men in the early church. There was no difference. Like when he says in the Bible, there's no Greek nor Jew, no male, no female. It was all the same. That was a really interesting part of the research for me. I really enjoyed researching that. So, in conclusion, these women, in my opinion, were very remarkable. They lived through times that were fairly patriarchal and difficult for women, and yet still left a mark on history. Some of them, like the missionaries in the Christian world or the Spartan women, they laid the foundation for what it means to be a modern independent woman today. And I think that's very inspirational. Love learning about them. So thank you for listening.